Hello, this is how to make a Python Flask app turned into a Docker image. I've got a folder called Docker Flask Demo. I've got Docker up and running, and I'll jump to Visual Studio Code. Press Ctrl-Shift-P to open up the menu, and I'm going to create a Python environment in this Docker folder. Now that is installing. We can see the .venv folder here. Once this is installed, we're going to create our Flask app in Python. So let's write main.py. Now I'm not going to explain how the Flask app works, but this is going to be the absolute basic thing. I assume you understand Python. So from Flask, import Flask. App equals Flask name. Then we'll add app root and make an index, which returns hello world. And then we're just going to return a really simple header which says hello world. And close out the header. And start our app. Now before I can run this, I will also need to install the Flask into this virtual environment. So I'll pip install Flask, and we're away. If I press F5, this will start running my Python script in VS Code. And as is typical for Flask, we have a server set up. If I click the link here and go to that web address, it is 127.0.0.1 and it's port 5000. Perfect, I can see hello world. So my Python Flask app, that works fine. We are returning effectively one header as our website. Alright, now I'll press Ctrl-C to get out of Flask. And in the terminal again, this time I'm going to type pip freeze, an arrow, or greater than, and requirements.txt. And this is going to create a text file with all of the libraries that we need to run this Python. So obviously there'll be Flask, there'll be the things behind the scenes that Flask relies on as well. Once we run this, we can see the requirements text file has been created. And if I open this up, here are our packages. Okay, let's close that down. The last thing we need to do is create another file, and we're just going to call this Docker file. No extension, just Docker file. This is where we're going to write down the instructions to create our Docker image. And again, I'm keeping this as simple as possible. First thing we need is Python. Use a Python base image. From Python, make sure it's got a lowercase p. You need a colon, and I'm using version 3.8. I'm going to create a working directory, so workdir. This is just going to be the name of a folder where everything is going to go. I'm going to name this differently. I'm just going to call it Python-Flask-Demo. Now the next stage is to use that requirements.txt file. First of all, we have to copy the requirements.txt into that folder we put above, and we're going to call it requirements.txt. So this looks kind of weird, but basically we're copying requirements.txt, and that copy is going to be called requirements. Then we need to install everything from requirements using pip. Pretty similar to what we'd do in command prompt. Next, we need to copy everything else. Now we could just do copy main.py, but let's just do copy dot space dot. That will copy everything into the Docker image. In order to get this to work outside of Docker, and in order to get this to work from just a normal web browser, we want to expose port 5000. It's as simple as typing expose 5000. And finally then we need to give a command here for Windows. So Windows runs Python, from the command prompt. We can type cmd, and then in the square brackets, make sure you're using double quotes here, not single quotes, Python, Again, no capital P. Main.py, that's where our application is. Okay, great. Let's save that. That is the Docker file done. Now, one last thing is if we go back to the main Python file here, I want to be as explicit as possible. So let's just say that the host here is going to be that same 0000, and the port is going to be 5000. Okay, we are ready to go. We are ready to create a Docker image. Now, Docker is open and running, which we need to have the Docker engine running behind the scenes. I'm going to open command prompt and firstly go to the folder, which I called earlier Docker Flask Demo. So this is the folder I showed on Windows. I can see if I look at the directory, those 4 files that I mentioned, the virtual environment, Docker file, our Python app, and requirements. Perfect. Now, just to double check I have Docker running properly, I can just type in the word Docker and get some basic help instructions. Now that that's running, type docker space build and the name that we want our image to be. So this, again, this can be anything. -T to put a tag or a name, and then the name that we want. So I'm going to say Python Flask app space and then a dot. So the dot at the end will make sure we include everything. Okay, this may take a fairly long time on your computer. I've run this a couple of times to experiment, so it's pretty quick for me. What we can see going on, you may have seen requirements.txt came up. There was installation of the required packages as well as Flask going on. So all of that is being built into an image, which we've called Python Flask app. Now if we jump back to the Docker desktop and click on images, hey, Python Flask app is there and it is ready to go. Now I could click run here and get this started. I'll do that in a second. The other way we can do this is through Docker. So let's type docker run. We need to put a port in, so -p, and then yeah, the name of our app, Python Flask app. Oh, sorry, I've done that wrong. Docker run, and then where we've got -p, that is expressing the port number. So let's put port 5000, 5000, Python Flask app. Cool. Now that looks pretty damn similar to what we saw in Visual Studio running the Flask app. And if we jump over to Firefox now and go to that same web address, that localhost 127.0.0.05000. Hello world. Now this is running in Docker. This is not the same thing we're running in Visual Studio. I'm going to press Ctrl-C and cancel out of that. If we go to containers, we can see that a randomly named container has been made. Okay, let's run this again from Docker this time. This time I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it Crash Bandicoot, and we're going to specify that this goes on port 5000. Press run again, and we will get the logs. Again, very similar stuff. I can see again that the Flask website is running in this Docker container. And we can see again in the Docker software, Crash Bandicoot is running with a link to the web ports. So to be clear what's happening then, we've made a really basic website using Python and Flask. We've packaged this up as a Docker image. Now the Docker image, that's going to be the thing that you send to other people, the thing that you download to install on your system. The container is the unpacked version running on your system. You can have more than one container for the same image, exactly like you can see on screen. And that's it. We have made a really basic website, made an image, and then run it as a container. Tatty bye!